Hello, everyone. Welcome. Hope you all had an amazing weekend. I'm happy to be back to start off another week in the NSE. Hello, and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 875th New Social Environment. I'm Eleanor, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Jay Clarke, Peter Acheson, David Carrier, and Sarah Jackson. We are thrilled to welcome poet Alan Fisher here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. We recognize that while land acknowledgements are not a replacement for necessary decolonial work, they serve as a reminder of place, of the legacies of dispossession and enslavement that sustain and enrich the stolen land we are speaking from. And now to introduce today's guests and host, Jay Clarke, the Rothman Family Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Art Institute of Chicago, most recently curated Bridget Riley drawings from the Artist Studio in 2022 and Edvard Munch, Trembling Earth. Jay has written several articles on Kathy Kollwitz, Edvard Munch, and the materials, processes, and markets of prints and drawings circa 1900. She received her master's and PhD from Brown University. Artist Peter Acheson is interested in graphing the overlaps of time, language, image, and nature. A refugee from the 80s Williamsburg scene, he now lives and works in the Hudson Valley. He has been an avid reader of archetypal psychology, artist biographies, and poetry. David Carrier taught philosophy in Pittsburgh and art history in Cleveland. He writes art criticism, and his book, In Caravaggio's Shadow, Naples as a Work of Art, is forthcoming. And our host today, Sarah Jackson, is a Jungian analyst and visual artist, as well as an adjunct faculty member and supervisor for the C.G. Jung Institute of New York. She's interested in the overlap and intersection of art and analytic psychology and lives in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And we're so thrilled and honored to have you all in dialogue here today. And with that, I'll just pass it over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Eleanor. So Munch has become practically synonymous with one image. We all know what that is. One image among his many, many drawings and prints and paintings. And the scream has, of course, become an emoji as well. Not a minor emoji, mind you, a major one, and a signifier of anxiety. This exhibit, which was 10 years in the making, and I hope that this panel, if it does nothing else, it'll encourage you to take a trip to Williamstown and see this really amazing show. It gives us not just a different side of Munch, but many different sides. A painterly painter of landscapes and seascapes, a chronicler of seasons and weather and rural goings-on, a painter of children in fantasy forests, a celebrant of nature, nudity, and male virility, and most astonishingly to me, a mystic. I hadn't known that side of Munch at all before this show. He was also exceedingly modern, as Peter Acheson pointed out to me when we were talking about the show, and way ahead of his post-impressionist peers, as David Carrier pointed out in his excellent review of the show in the Rail. As a Jungian psychoanalyst, I find myself much more interested in Munch's ecstatic mystical side than in his anxious, alcoholic, traumatized side that we're probably better acquainted with, or I was better acquainted with before this show. And I also had a wrong impression about his later work, that it was not as good as the early work, and this show completely turns that on its head as well. As an artist, I'm really interested in his use of color and in the many strangely awkward and yet really lyrical passages in the paintings and prints and drawings. And I'll be showing a few of my own slides of details to point that out later. So now we have the great honor and pleasure of being led through not all the images in the show, but a good many of them by one of the people who put them together and arranged them, one of the curators, Jay Clarke.
Hello, everybody. Great to be here. So, Sarah, are we gonna go? Do you want to go through some of the works? Okay. I don't actually have the slide presentation on my screen. There we go. Great. So this is the entrance to the exhibition. And just to give a sense, the design team who put the initial concept together is from IKD, which is a design firm. And the two partners are Yugan Kim and Tomomi Itakura. And so together with my colleagues at the Clarke, and we chose some of these designs. And one great idea they had that I want to point out here, which you can see a bit, are the tilted walls. In each room, there's a wall that doesn't run on a sort of, it runs diagonally. And at first I was worried this would be, would feel slightly gimmicky, you know, Munch the Scream, just disordered, not in, 90-degree angles. But the wonderful thing that it does is it really kind of leads you into the other rooms and lets you see the other rooms instead of blocking your view. So they did a fantastic job organizing the architectural layout and the layout of the walls. And then the Clarke team really chose the wall colors. And that was really fun because, as we all know, colors are very important. Hopefully it's not the first thing you notice. It's not a distraction. It's not overpowering to the work. But the first room is the forest room, which we'll be talking about. And because I find these works to still be very surprising, we wanted that wall color to be very dark and evocative. And here we see the room, which looks at Munch's interaction with the farming world, with apple trees and horses. And this, I think, was quite surprising to people. This room in particular, very beautiful, highly colored works. So we go on to the next one. I was so delighted to have these two paintings together. I had never seen them together. And they're both from the same view. One is just pure landscape and the other has a figure in the front. The work on the left, it was the first, which is now in the Carnegie in Pittsburgh, was the first painting to enter a museum collection in the United States. And the treatment of the trees is really spectacular. It's great to have them on the same wonderful purple wall. And this color purple echoes through all of the rooms. It's sort of the one joining color in all of them. And again, this gives you a sense of the different colors and the different angled walls. And we have the person who did the lighting, Tim, is very talented, and that's sort of an unseen component of every exhibition is the lighting. This gives you another sense of sort of the wall openings as well. So there's an interpenetration between the spaces, and you can see one room to the next. So I will stop there. But that just gives you a sense of the layout of the exhibition. It's laid out thematically in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different rooms. And I'm sure we're going to talk about that as well.
So I was wondering, Jay, whether you could take us through the next few slides just to give us a sense of particular paintings. Would you mind doing that?
No, I would love to.
A little bit, and then I'll take over when we get to I take over when we get to the 41st slide.
Okay, wonderful. So this painting is called The Yellow Log. It's absolutely stunning. And it wasn't supposed to be the first painting you see when you walk in the door. But the second we got it out of the crate, we changed the whole layout of the first room because it's absolutely spectacular. So here you see Munch in 1912. He's living in the country. And one thing I find quite astounding about this painting, not only just the beauty of the yellow logs, but the sort of circular cellular forms that are on these purple trees as you look behind you. Next image. And here we see the logger. You know, one of the things we think about a lot today is the question of deforestation. And that wasn't necessarily an issue around the time when Munch painted it, but was beginning to be an issue. A very good friend of his at this time was his parents had an industry, a logging industry, and that was beginning to be written about 12 years later. It was becoming more of an issue that was being discussed. But I love the very vertical format here of this man and his very small head. This painting absolutely blew me away. I'd never seen it before. And this slide, of course, doesn't even come close to capturing it. But this painting was in a private collection for many, many years in Dallas, Texas, before it was given as a gift to the museum. And the one thing that really struck me about this is we're walking along a pathway and there's sort of a hillside that we see to the right. And to me, it really looked like flesh, organs, lungs. There was something very anthropomorphic about it. And that's one thing that interests me throughout the exhibition. It's one thing to read about it, to read about anthropomorphism and how some of these strange forms become other forms. But when you're in the exhibition and you're face to face with the works of art, it becomes very real that Munch is really creating one thing out of another as he's painting. This one as well is really an astounding painting. If you look at the tree on the left-hand side, I better stop talking so much because we have 41 slides to get through. I'll start speeding up. But you can see kind of a face figure, a sort of profile of a face. It's really just a stunning, this blue really pops right out at you, as does the area that's taking on the sunlight at the bottom part of the canvas. Next image. This is a really interesting series of paintings the artist does called Children in a Forest, a Fairy Tale Forest. It's a series of works he does over a period of decades. And it very much connects to, you know, the Norwegian tradition of fairy tales, as well as a sort of sense of childhood wonder and childhood danger. This is another painting I had not seen until it arrived. Absolutely gorgeous. A series of paintings he did called Elm Forest in Spring. He did particularly during this time period, and they all take on a very different tonality and different color palette. This is called The Magic Forest. I'm going to say basically, oh my gosh, this one is my favorite because, you know, you say that about all of them, but a very, very strange painting. And I think Sarah kind of brought up the question of a sort of goofiness, a slightly caricatural nature to some of these paintings, which I find quite fascinating and sort of, you know, modern, anti-modern in a way. Here we see a group of a mother and a child walking into a forest. But I want you to see right at the end of the pathway that they're walking, there's a series of trees that come together as a clump. That's another sort of leitmotif in the artist's work. This painting really, this is the one that people said reminded them of one of the critics I was walking through has said it reminded them of the Canadian artist Emily Carr. And I was a little bit worried, to be honest, that people were going to be in Williamstown in the summer and say, do we really need to think about winter? But people really love the winter landscapes as well. This is a painting that I think really surprised people. Again, people said it looked like Gustav Klimt, which is not untrue, but a very late work by the artist where he's painting his home and studio in Ekeli on the outskirts of Oslo. Just a lushly beautiful, beautiful painting. And this is another one of my favorites. It's just so un-Munchian, right? When you look at it, you would not even think it was by the artist. But I love the fact, I love the colors. I love the way he paints it. I love the fact that he focuses, the first thing you see is the man's behind pointing right at us and the horse sort of looking right at it in a rather quizzical manner. But he was very involved in farming, in the farming community in which he lived and the land on which he lived during the later part of his life. This is a self-portrait. Obviously, it's probably done in Warnemünde when he was living on the Baltic coast in Germany. And again, it has a kind of odd quality to it. But I love the sky, how the sky and the clouds seem to sort of press in on his head, and he places himself within that environment. Another great painting outside of his house. We put this right in the first room because I think it's important to to see how the artist places himself within the landscape. And a lot of people say, oh, he looks so mean and crabby. I think he's probably just squinting at the sun, but he's not a smiling figure, but also very interesting. There's a sunflower next to him, and the hand right in front of him as well. This is a beloved painting from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, a very early work. And here we see this woman with her hands behind her back in sort of a vulnerable position, standing in the forest, standing vertically with the trees, and then this very well-known sunset, which has its path going along the water, the reflection, and all these verticals sort of working within one another. And then the shoreline is again in bands, which I'm quite fascinated by as well. The band of green, the band of the shoreline, and then the band of the water, all quite separate from one another. So we've got horizontals and verticals. And this is a painting done 2 years later, which shows a very different perspective. Although in theory, you just take the woman out, but it's a completely different painting with its tonality, with the veils of paint, which you can see in the green below, and the branches of the trees really looking more like clouds in the sky than anything else. This is a painting called Beach. And it's quite interesting because my colleague, Esther Bell, who's was then the chief curator, now the deputy director of the Clarke, we really kind of went back and forth of whether about to include this painting because there was a clumsiness to it that I was worried about. But in the end, she was totally right. When you see it in person, it's lush and very surprising and beautiful in its clumsiness, I would say as well. This is quite a remarkable painting, Separation. Here we see a man and a woman separating from one another. The blood that falls from his heart actually nourishes the plant below, which Munch himself called the flower of pain. And her hair, as if by static electricity, is connecting back to him while they separate. Then this is a lithograph the artist did later, which is completely different in a way, although one could say it's a lithograph done after the painting. The elements are very different. His eyes are sort of bulging out, sort of staring eyes, but we have the same figure of the woman, again, in a white dress with her hair connecting to the man, and these sort of, again, as if by static electricity. This is a very rare impression of a well-known image by Munch called Ashes. And you see in Norwegian below, aske. So what we have here is a man and a woman whose relationship has dissolved, and he's lying like a pile of ashes below him as their love sort of goes up into flames. Another image of separation, this sort of a close-up view of that same couple. And another image of ashes done a couple of years later. Munch, another thing we can talk about, often repeated his subjects and his themes in a variety of ways. This is Two People, the Lonely Ones, a motif that Munch did in painting in a variety of different printmaking methods. And again, it's a man and a woman who in theory are together, but very much isolated from one another and separated. And one of the things we may or may not talk about is the printmaking matrix, the woodblock, the series of woodblocks he used to make this print in a variety of colors. Another motif of the lonely one. Another motif of the lonely one, very different. a color mezzotint or burnished aquatint, as some people think. And another image of melancholy. This is very, very rare. There are very few impressions of this print ever made. So some of them are very iconic. We've seen them again and again, but this one, there are very few impressions in the world, really just a handful. So it's amazing we got it for the exhibition. Another group, this probably an old woman or a figure of death, or as some people say, Darth Vader on the beach. Her face looks a tiny bit like Darth Vader. But again, two lonely figures by the shore. The fantastic painting from the Museum of Modern Art in New York of a storm. And one of Munch's friends writes how they were envisioning, they were looking at a storm, they're looking out at the water, and these women are sort of doing this scream gesture, screaming in fear, probably looking out at their beloved, who are mostly fishermen and out at sea during the storm. And you can see the house behind them has this sort of eerie glowing sensibility to it. Beautiful White Night by Munch, very, very differently painted in 1900, 1901, just 7 years after the MoMA painting. And this is a group that Munch did, a group of paintings that Munch did when he was preparing to make canvases for the university auditorium in Oslo. This is a sort of an early experiment he did, geniuses in the sun rays. So we see these little genies going to flying towards the sun rays, sort of like little putti. This is another one of my absolute favorite drawings here, we called Metabolism. And we're going to get at this a little bit later. The idea that everything is interconnected. So this woman's dying body nourishes the earth, out of which grows whatever elements then fertilize the land on which flowers grow, on which the woman's pregnant belly is growing while the sun shines on her. But I do think it's interesting that the little sperm-like images that are coming up from the ground are also rather scream-like in a way. This is part of a very large series which Munch did called The Human Mountain, which again relates to a sort the connection between the earth and the sky and the sun, because this figure, which you can barely see at the top, is raising their hands towards the sun. And we're very lucky to have in the exhibition 2 different sheets from a very important book that Munch created, a sort of series of drawings that he put into a great big book called The Tree of Knowledge of Good and Evil. And here this sort of gives a sense of the earth and the planets and the suns and the stars all being interconnected, entitled The Earth Loves the Air. And this is definitely a crowd favorite, The Sun, which again was part of that series, the group of paintings that Munch did for the university in Oslo. Is this our last one? Great.
Yes.
Hopefully that just gives you a sense of the different kinds of works in the exhibition, from paintings to drawings to prints.
Thank you so much, Jay, for giving us that wonderful overview and for allowing me to rearrange the work. It wasn't quite in the groups that it's in the show, but you moved very fluidly anyway from one to the next. So thank you. I came up with some questions that I wanted to ask the panel. I had intended just to ask David and Peter what surprised you most about the show, but then you spoke, Jay, about what, feeling surprised yourself to see some of the work you hadn't seen before, to see the work there assembled together. And I just wondered if you might start by just expanding on that a little bit. Like, what surprised you?
Yeah, I'm not going to pick a particular image because so many of them surprised me. And again, I'd seen these in reproduction. I'd seen most of them in person, but I think it's one of those, we all know the experience of you get a group of works together in a room and they speak to each other in different ways and you see different things, or the color complexity or the color interconnections surprise you. But there are many, the anthropomorphism, which was what was really coming out for me. And part of me was worried that it was something in my head because I had written about it so much, and it was very gratifying with the people that we were installing with were seeing it as well.
I loved also that you mentioned the awkwardness that's in some of them. And I hadn't heard anybody talk about that, but I noticed it and wondered at it. So it doesn't detract in any way. It's just sort of strange and interesting. Peter and David, I'm curious what you found surprising when you went to see the show.
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I was very surprised and impressed by what I came away with was a sense of the entire Munch cosmology. Despite the various subcategories of scenes and types of paintings and media, I really came away with a very coherent, like he created a very coherent cosmology in which, beginning with, I would say, with his own individuality as a single artistic person, extending to his issues with the partner, the love, the rejected lover, extending out into the class structure, the laborers of the village life, all more or less existing under the sun, being fed by the sun, being fed by the green growth, being fed by the trees, and then slipping in, not to be overlooked, the reflective aspect of the moon, the nocturnes and the moonscapes, the moonlight scenes. And I really felt like he covered almost all the bases of a local culture that expands ever outward all the way up to the universe. And I just never had considered him that his work would have put that together. And I read something that I'm going to read that he said, just to kind of put the period on the end of the sentence, because it's his idea, not mine. He wrote, I think in the early 1912, he said, "A country's artists, its poets, are sensitive phonographs as in sound. They have received the noble and painful ability to record the waves emitted by society." And that really struck me as a unifying theme in not only the subject matter of the paintings, but the way they were painted, which is why I referred to them as really ultra modern, that the waves and the visual sort of sensation of color was sort of detached from its descriptive use. And he really gets into some very pure sensory, sort of almost what he might call electromagnetic kind of pulses. And I was just surprised that I was very, very impressed by the unity of the cosmology that I kind of came out of the show appreciating.
Beautifully said. Great observations. Thank you. David, did you want to speak about this a little bit? Just what surprised you about the show?
You got this. Yeah, here I am. I was surprised by the color, which I thought was unlike anyone else of that time. I mean, we speak of him as a post-impressionist, but you can wander over to the main building of the Clarke, and what you see there is just completely different. I mean, no one, Camille Pizarro, Van Gogh, none of them look anything like him. I thought that was really important. Maybe that's compatible with what was just being said. I think that the symbolism is interesting, and that picture we ended up with, the sun, of course, put me in mind of Hilma af Klint. I mean, a parallel association, but it's interesting that cosmology was in the air, in the Scandinavian countries at that time. The related thing I might stress about is that it's important, I think, that he lived forever. He lived to be 80. And I don't know that I saw a lot of development in his work. I mean, to be honest, if I was given a quiz and what was in 1890 and what was in 1930, I don't know that I could. I mean, it's as if he found something very original and, in a certain amount of provincial isolation, I think. And then he kept going with that and going with that. And the last thing, I mean, just to round up this group of points, is I agree with what was said at the start about the display. I think it was just spectacular. And what we should mention for the audience here is that these galleries are actually in the basement. And yet it's none of that basement, bomb shelter effect that you can feel sometimes in basement galleries. It was a wonderful, it really let the paintings breathe. And I don't think there could be a better display of these works than we saw in Williamstown. And by the way, it's open until mid-October. So there it is.
Mhm. Thank you, David. So I wanted to ask all three of you, what surprised you most? I already asked you that. What if you could take one or two of them home with you, which ones are your absolute favorites? And David, you had said to me, when I asked that question around in an email, you mentioned the sun, which we just were looking at. Yeah. And I can't think of a better one to take home than this. And it's, as we said, it's a study for a really gigantic version that's still on display in the hall, the Aula Hall at the University of Oslo. Peter, you chose a couple, and we finally found one of them this morning from the Clarke images. If you go forward, Eleanor, to that, yeah, fertility. So why this one, Peter?
Let's see. I'm off mute. Okay. This really sums up Munch, a lot of themes in Munch for me. He's got all the elements here. And what I find really poignant is the separation of the two figures with this wounded tree between them. And the wound, the cut off limb, seems to be just kind of radiating. I mean, it's like the center of the painting. It's, it's just awesomely modern in composition. Really daring to put that orange right in the middle, orange circle right in the middle of the painting. But I find it combines so many of his themes. And one thing the word that came to mind when I was thinking about his depictions of the loggers generally, and that really bloody sort of excavated hillside that Jay was talking about in the introduction, the sense of woundedness of nature and the kind of pathos that in order to make their lives in this period in Norway, one had to till the fields, one had to cut down trees, one had to gouge the landscape. And, it just, rather than just documenting it as a fact of life, I feel Munch puts these two figures, so it immediately becomes a metaphor for, alienation, loneliness, the impossibility of love, or, the wound, the injuring that we will all sustain through the process of life. I mean, I just find this image so poetic and so complete that if David gets the sun painting, I'll take this one.
Great choice. Eleanor, if you go forward one, please. I sort of surprised myself by choosing this one. It's such a beauty. If you go forward one more, the detail on the left side just knocked me out. The abstraction of the painting on the left side of this one is just astounding to me. So that's a favorite of mine. So if we go forward one more, and then, I wanted to talk a little bit, or to ask you guys a little bit about chronology, whether chronology seemed important in this show. To me, I was really surprised by how unimportant it seemed. If this print was made in 1897, And if we go forward to the next one, Eleanor, same block, obviously prepared differently and perhaps recarved and printed in 1915. So 18 years difference between those two prints. And he seemed to go back and forth in that way, in his prints, in his drawings, in his paintings, with revisiting motifs and subjects, handling them differently. It just, the chronology seemed sort of irrelevant and very flexible to me. And I wondered if any of you, David or Peter or Jay, had wanted to say anything about that or disagree, perhaps.
I'd love to just jump in about chronology. One of the reasons that we wanted to have it as a thematic exhibition is to look at these themes that he dealt with very frequently in his life. But one of the things I wanted to both step away from and also secretly concentrate on was there's this sort of mythic break between the pre-nervous breakdown monk before 1908 and the post-nervous breakdown monk. Nervous breakdown, I put that in quotes, or, alcohol treatment center, whatever we want to call it. We're not necessarily going to get into that now. But there's this perception that he was this great, tortured artist. And then he, got his, what together. And then he became, less interesting. And he, became more colorful. And he went from the depressed monk to the happy monk. Well, you see both on both sides of that pretend 1908, 1909 dividing line. And that's one thing I wanted to sort of erase, that pre and post, the early and late monk. But at the same time, I hope people will see some of the later paintings, which have been to some extent dismissed as less interesting, less important, and also interesting the fact that we've never seen a lot of them because they're not shown as much, because they're not the vampire, they're not the scream. So that was one thing that I was hoping to show by being completely silent about it, was how the late monk is really quite fascinating and worth looking at.
I totally agree with that. It's kind of a revelation of this show. David, you said something to me about when I brought up these two prints, that you had read that actually he went back because he got a commission or a buyer or something, and went back and reprinted reworked a block because of a commission, perhaps, or a potential sale. And I hadn't even thought of that more pragmatic angle when I was looking at these two prints. So if we go forward, Eleanor, of course we have to look at this painting.
Let me just finish that.
Oh yeah, go ahead, David. Sorry.
We're finishing the house, and there's at least one story in the biography of someone, I think a doctor, showing up and saying, by the way, could you give me a print of that woodcut, from 15 years earlier? And he says, well, I have it right in the basement. I'll print one for you. So, I think the chronology, because he owned an enormous quantity of his own work. And at the very end of his life, the whole poignant business was that in the German occupation of Norway, he was worried because he was listed as one of the artists, the condemned artists, the degenerate, that this work was all going to disappear somehow. So it had to be hidden away. So, there's just a lot of his work there. But the broader point I would make about this is that, and this is why I think the show is important, is that the Munch problem, in a way, in terms of reputation, is that too much of the work is in Norway. And I mean by that, I'm not being anti-Norwegian, I mean by that means that we don't have a representative sample of his works in the way that we do of the post-impressionists. It isn't like everything by Van Gogh is in Holland. And so that part of it, I think the revelation of the show is simply to see these works. If you look at the fine print in the catalog, I think most of the works come from Norwegian collection. Is this right? Can someone check? So it's a revelation to open him up in that way.
A large number come from 33 of the works come from the Munch Museum. A number of works come in private collections from all over. But you're absolutely right. A minority come from public collections in the US.
And maybe the thing I should just add as a footnote is, of course, we think of Norway as this bubbling, prosperous oil state, but this is really recent. I mean, even, I don't know, when I was there 15 years ago, they didn't have a Munch museum yet. This is a brand new creation, all this. And so I think for the scholars, his reputation is going to change now that a lot of his work is accessible. Because I trying to remember, do you remember, Jay? He left something like 1,000 paintings to the nation, something like that, incredible number. Have you gone through that whole archive?
I'm not all of it, but you're right. When he
Must be.
died, he gave his money to the city of Oslo.
Yeah.
Thousands and thousands of works, paintings, drawings, prints, sculpture that no
Yeah,
one's really ever seen.
he was a pack rat. He had a lot of houses.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. I wanted to go on to the next slide, Eleanor. So this is a great monumental painting that we haven't looked at yet. And there are a small series of male bathers in the show that are quite astonishing. And this was a painting that, well, the people around me, I went to the show twice, and the people around me were, of course, talking about Jasper Johns because of the cross-hatching in the background. And Johns was a great lover of Edvard Munch and apparently owned a Munch, although I haven't been able to find which one he might have owned. But anyway, this is a powerful painting, painted when I call him Jung also, it's the UN, when Munch was spending time in Germany by the seaside, and he was very much in recovery and swimming and being in the sun, and his philosophical mystical ideas about the rejuvenation from sun and sea were in full swing. So I wanted to show two details from this painting that are most peculiar. This is this is one, and then there's one more. It's just odd and awkward and strange and wonderfully abstract and modern. And then as the host, I got to have some fun and take some liberties. So if we go on to the next one, this again is one of those great paintings from that group. So modern and so abstract. I was trying to find a painting to juxtapose with it on the same slide. You know, Dievenkorn, Jasper Johns, Joan Mitchell, de Kooning. I couldn't find the right one, but it brings so many much more contemporary painters to mind, and other painters much younger than the ones I just mentioned. Let's go forward one more. So this young man on the beach from 1908, I couldn't resist juxtaposing the Cézanne bather, the famous one that's at MoMA on the left.
And if I can just jump in quickly, Sarah, Jasper Johns does own a very similar Cézanne bather to that bather. So that's kind of an interesting Munch, Cézanne, Johns connection.
Nice. Lucky guy. I just loved seeing these two together. The Cézanne is from 1885, I think. It's a good bit earlier. But I had the date written down and I'm just not seeing it. But I just enjoyed seeing these two together. And of course, Munch saw he was in Paris and surely was acquainted with Cézanne's work, but went in so much in his own direction with the same subject matter. If we can go forward, Eleanor. So this is one of those wonderful celebratory paintings of farming and farmland from 1916, and it brought to mind two other artists contemporaries of Munch's from Germany, Kirchner on the left and Franz Marc on the right, both of whom made wonderful paintings and prints and drawings of horses. Kirchner, I found it just by chance. I happened to see that there's going to be a Munch and Kirchner show at the Yale University Art Museum opening in February. And it will be earlier work, more typical work of Munch's, more prints of figures and similar prints of Kirchner's, but that will be really interesting to see. If we could go forward. And then this is one of those on the left, one of these fantastic, strange illustrations for the book that he made that Jay has told us about on the left. And it brought to mind Helma af Klint on the far right, one of her drawings, and in the center, a mandala of Jung's. And it happens to be the first mandala that he made in a notebook while he was doing his military service in Switzerland in 1917. And he developed it into a practice for himself that helped kind of keep himself cohered during that period of time. But mandalas, of course, are archetypal, and it means circle in Sanskrit. And I would define it as a concentric image which has a centering and meditative effect both upon the maker and the viewer, or makers, because the Tibetan sand paintings are made by a group of people. And it evokes and perhaps represents, we might say, unity, wholeness, infinity, and timelessness. And that was the period for Munch in which he was both beginning to start the preparatory, well, actually, this is 1930, so this is after the commission for the big paintings at the university, but he was in his late, more mystical, philosophical phase, influenced, and Jay can speak to this a little bit more if we have time, what some of those ideas were and the philosophers and scientists who influenced him. But I just first wanted to go ahead one more to the actual version of the sun that's at the university. It's still there. And it's a spectacular mandala. I mean, that's sort of how I look at it. And then one more just for fun. The version of the screen that's in the show, this wonderful lithograph, I took a picture of, we already have looked at that painting of the storm on the left, but the figures, the women who are doing a gesture similar to the famous figure in the screen, they're actually holding their hats on. I think that's what's happening. They're holding their hats on in the wind. So it's not so emotional. It's more practical in that sense. So I thought it was sort of fun seeing them side by side. And then I just have two more details, and then I'm done with the images that I chose. This is a detail of that elm forest in spring painting that we looked at before. And the painterly lyrical passages in these landscapes are just amazing to me. And the last one is a detail of the one that Jay, you said it looked a bit like Klimt, which it does. Yeah. So now we have just a little more time, but we could start our Q&A early, or we could talk a little bit more. What do you think? Do you want to say anything, Jay, about some of those, a little bit more about those ideas? I wasn't very articulate about that. He was influenced by Haeckel.
Yes, definitely. There's actually an essay in the catalog, and a friend of mine, Allison Moorhead, who happens to be on this call, wrote a recent book that connects Munch's work, and as a forthcoming exhibition as well, Munch's work to the natural sciences as well, sort of science and medicine. But he was very influenced by Ernst Haeckel and some of those later drawings, like, for example, the one where the spheres, the interlocking spheres, that's how we got the title of the exhibition, Trembling Earth, because that's actually one of the words in one of those drawings where the earth meets the earth meets the air, and the mountain kind of goes like this. That's where we got the title from, translated from Norwegian into English. And his own writings were Munch's own writings were very mystical, this idea of monism, or the idea that a drop of blood connects to the planetary sphere. That drawing we saw of metabolism, that decomposing body connects to the sun shining on the earth. So the sort of the intertwining. There's another drawing that will be shown. There are two subsequent venues to this exhibition. The next one at the Barberini Museum in Potsdam, and the last venue at, of course, the Munch Museum in Oslo, which is and it's illustrated in the catalog of a man's head in between the layers of rocks. So again, the idea that the stones can breathe, that everything has a life force to it. So that was very much, and again, if you want to read more about that, it's in the catalog, and a lot of the aula and literature around the aula that so it's really fascinating when you look at Munch from that perspective. And when you think of the scream, then I hope the scream you can see from a different perspective as well, because there's an inscription, "I felt the great scream through nature." So in many ways, the scream is a kind of landscape image, just as much as it is about the screaming figure running towards us.
Thank you. That also in Trina's essay in the essays in the catalog are fantastic, including yours. And Trina writes about Munch's belief in rocks being alive in a sense, and crystallization. He was fascinated by crystallization and the experiments and discoveries that were going on in crystallography at the time. So, but that's pretty wild and radical. The idea that rocks he didn't distinguish between the animate and the inanimate in the way that we do typically.
Yeah, and as Peter mentioned, the idea of radio waves and electrical waves, he received a form of electromagnetic therapy. Today, we would call it electroshock therapy. An earlier version of that was performed on him when he was at a hospital in Copenhagen. And then earlier in his life, he wrote that he sees in waves, he sees in wavelengths. He saw the shore as the perpetually shifting lines of life. So there was always this connection between the seemingly animate and inanimate.
Indeed.
Sarah, can I jump in here?
Yes, please.
I'd also love to hear the panel's reactions to, I don't believe any were included in this show, although I didn't think to look carefully until I got home, looking through a Munch catalog at the paintings he made around 1930 when he had his eye surgery. He developed eye problems in his left eye. And, being the curious kind of mystic that he was, instead of, cursing the gods, he essentially closed his right eye. His right eye was afflicted, I think. He closed his left eye and he made a series of paintings that are very reminiscent of those mandalic drawings you just showed of what the world looked like through the afflicted eye. And it impressed me so much in terms of the modernity question, because it seems to me that the idea of illustrating and painting the wound, let's call it, as subject matter is one thing, but to paint by means of the wound, to see by means of the wound, really carries it to a kind of authentic questioning and curiosity that I find stunningly modern and brave. And the paintings of that period look a little like Hilma Klimt. They look a little like some Arthur Dove or Georgia O'Keeffe watercolors. I mean, they have this sort of cosmic, almost tantric, circular image, often interrupted by some kind of large bird of prey. He calls it an eagle. I mean, what a nut. But I just love that you could say he not only saw the wound and painted it, but he saw by means of the wound. And I just thought that brings him squarely up into the modern world that we're in, the sort of with all the environmental references in his work, something about not distancing it as subject matter, but embracing it as a method seems to hold some kind of clue that I find could be amplified, but I find that very, very, very interesting. And that's one thing I never saw that coming. I was really took that away with from the show.
Thank you. Oh, what a great discussion. I wish we could go on and on, but now we get to bring the audience in.
Yes, thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Jay and David and Peter. Before we move into the audience Q&A, I just wanted to see, just as you all have such interesting and varied connections to the show, if you have any questions for each other. No pressure, but.
Well, I'm just in awe that there were 3 main curators, right, Jay?
Yes, myself, Trine Otterbach-Nielsen from the Munch Museum in Norway, and Jill Lloyd, who's the guest curator of the exhibition for the Barberini Potsdam. We had a lot of fun working on the show together.
And maybe being 3 women helped, but I just can't imagine how you went about that, the 3 of you collaborating.
Well, we started, it started during, I had initially come up with the idea when I was a curator at the Clarke, and I pitched it to the Munch Museum. And because, of course, when you work on an exhibition at the Munch Museum, you very much want their support and need their support because they have such great riches there. And then when the Barberini and the Munch Museum came on board as partners with us, Jill and Trine and we met in Oslo. We went through the storage spaces together. We went through the vaults, which was so much fun, as you can imagine. I definitely should not have been paid for those few days of my life. And then we had a lot of meetings on Zoom and a lot of great discussions and disagreements about what's in the show, what's out of the show. The Munch Museum and the Barberini's physical spaces are bigger, so their exhibitions will be numerically larger. So that had to come into consideration as well. But we really had a great time working on the show.
And when it came to doing the actual model, the maquette?
The maquette for the exhibition, the Clarke does their maquette and their layout. The Barberini's is different. The Munch Museum's is different. So that's when we started working with Yogun and Tomomi at IKD Design. And then it's really the Clarke team that works with the designers, the curators and the designers and the editors and, all of my colleagues at the Clarke. We really made those decisions together. And then I would go to the Clarke and the paint samples. The paint colors are very important for exhibitions. So we had a number of different possibilities for the paint colors and then the font of the labels, and then comes in the editing of the labels. So it's definitely a team effort all the way.
Fantastic wall colors.
Yeah, agreed. Amazing. Well, thank you for that so much. We do have some really great questions from the audience. So the first question I will ask on behalf of Anne Delaney. Anne asks, is Edvard Munch considered a symbolist? And anyone can feel free to jump in and answer that question.
I'll just jump in. I think at certain points in his life, he definitely could be considered a symbolist. In the art historical canon, if you will, he is considered a symbolist, which I know David said post-impressionist. Post-impressionism and symbolism can be seen as somehow anonymous. I'm working on an exhibition that is currently called Symbolism, which I don't want to use that word because it's so vague. I think some people would consider him a symbolist, but others might think of him as an expressionist.
Thank you. Our next question is going to be from John in the audience. John, you should be able to unmute.
Thank you very much. A great discussion, a beautiful exhibit. I hope to get up there. My question is, given Munch's themes of labor and nature, did he support the working class movements that were, so important during his lifetime?
He definitely did. And there's a whole series, Gerd Voll, who's the most amazing Munch scholar, who she wrote an entire book on Munch and the workers. He was very interested, and I think that's part of his interaction with the people farming on his land. And then workers coming home from, there's workers in the snow. There's a variety of series. His politics hasn't been investigated as much as one might hope, but more and more in the scholarly literature. And he was definitely interested in workers' movements.
Can I just do one quick follow-up? There are painters like Sorolla in Spain. There's a kind of working class naturalism that's prevalent in the area. Could he be considered within that style of regional naturalism?
Does anyone else want to take that on? I'm happy to. So you mean you're connecting him with regional naturalism, aka Sorolla?
Yeah.
That's a tough question. I mean, he was, he spent a lot of his life in Germany. So the Germans try to adopt him as their own at one point. Munch is more German than we are, for example. But then 2 world wars, he was obviously spending more time in Oslo. And now he's a very celebrated Norwegian artist. He wasn't so much earlier in his career. So I don't really think I'm answering your question, but national naturalism, I mean, there was a sort of neo-romanticism that was certainly prevalent in Norway at that time. Neo-romanticism, which others would call symbolism, just as it was happening with Arnold Boecklin in Germany and Switzerland, for example. So there is a bit of a nationalist impulse there, which hopefully answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so much, John. Really great questions. Our next question is going to be from Allison. And Allison, you should be able to unmute to ask.
Thanks so much. This question really follows up on John's prior question, which is also addressing to Jay, but also want to thank all the participants and Sarah for the masterful hosting of this talk. Norway became an independent nation for the first time in 1905. And so I haven't yet had a chance to get to Massachusetts, but I think that some of the radiance of the subsequent work and the possibility of commissions, of course, must be tied to that.
Great question, Allison. Nice to see you. Yes, I think that isn't, I mean, although in, Munch every summer was in Norway. He went to his sort of summer home, as you could call it, in Oskarstrand. And I think there's certainly a celebration of a very specific Norwegian landscape. He was very involved, the last room of the exhibition is really about place, the importance of place for him. And Norway was certainly a very important component of that. The commission to do the University Hall in Oslo, Munch worked on that commission for years and years and years and was finally awarded the commission. So he wasn't really perceived as a national artist until a little bit later in his career. As I said before, he was really perceived as a sort of, adopted in Germany and less so in Norway. But 2 world wars, keeping him at home, specifically the First World War, he spent a lot of time in Norway and had property there. So I think you're absolutely right. There's certainly a national component to these works as well. Natural, and I must say, another very important equation is what was known as the vitalist movement there, which was really an embrace of nature, being outdoors, being nude, being in the sunshine, sort of healing oneself by being in nature.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison. That was a really great question. And thanks, Jay. The next question I will be asking on behalf of Hope. Hope is asking, in regards to the male bathers works, does anyone think that perhaps he was a repressed gay man?
I could go on and on and on about that, so I'm going to see if anyone else wants to. take
I
a
was
stab.
wondering about that when I was looking at those paintings. He certainly didn't, he seemed so tortured, with women. Things with women didn't go well.
He definitely had difficult relationships with women. I don't know anywhere that he had sexual relations, physical relations with men, but he did have this idea that he didn't want to, at certain points in his life, literally let go of his sperm because he felt that that was an important part of his creative energy. He also had an idea that he didn't want to conceive of children with a woman because he didn't want to pass on his mental illness to subsequent generations. But I don't think the bathers should, I mean, one could certainly read them as homoerotic. There's no question about, there's a whole series of nude male bathers. Somebody said in the chat, Akins, a group of artists in Scandinavia doing this kind of imagery. But I think we have to remember, that people that bathe naked on a regular basis, it wasn't seen as so taboo then. And it was also a part of like, be naked, be in nature, swim in the nude, soak up the sunshine. It was very much of a vitalist influence. But I'm sure there's literature somewhere on that, but I won't say that they could definitely be homoerotic, but I don't know if they show any hidden homoerotic desires on his part. But what do I know?
There's a bunch of photography that he did, which we haven't really brought up, but he took a lot of self-portraits of himself naked, which I'm hearing this sort of vitalist, this kind of imagery. It also seems that in the early days of photography, the male nude was really a big subject. Some of Munch's photos almost remind me of Muybridge's. It looks like he took multiple exposures in the studio. He was really experimental, and I see it more like that in that tradition that might include Akins and Muybridge, but.
The Germans are famous for skinny dipping. That's for still doing it. And they were back then.
Thank you so much for those insights. That was really interesting to consider for sure. And thank you again, Hope, for sending in that question. Our next question is going to be from our friend GE. And GE, I'm not sure if GE is still here. Well, I'll read GE's question. GE is wondering, is there any artist of that age other than perhaps Van Gogh who displays such spasms of optimism and dread in glorious tension?
Huh.
That's a very good question.
Thinking of Redon, it's not the best answer, but he had both extremes in his work.
He had like his Redon's amazingly strong black and white works, and then incredible use of color at the same time. Yeah. That's a very good question. I would say no, but that's the easy answer. Maybe David and Peter have other ideas.
No one comes to mind. Redon's a pretty good answer.
Well, I think that's really fascinating. I would put this in a more general way by asking about his color. And it would be interesting to see what was Norwegian painting like when he was a student. Well, is he completely self-conceived, or does he look like he fits within a tradition? I have a vague sense of looking in the bio that the early paintings were kind of dark and not so exciting, but I don't know. I'd be very interested to know, how he discovered himself. And I even wonder, and I had a question for Jay about whether there was something about the pigments, because the colors are so unusual. Those are really those are manic colors. I mean, I walked through the show and I felt like it was the opposite of how, you go to a show and you say, I need coffee. But this was the opposite. I needed whatever the opposite of coffee was, because especially when you're in the basement there, and these are pushing you up and up. And I don't, there's something very odd about him. I mean, it's manic through and through to me. All those violets, those harsh colors. It's Janacek. If the Clarke played Janacek through the Sinfonetta, through the galleries, that would be if they did music, that would be the perfect complement. And it's very strange. I don't know what this says about Norway. I mean, I have a sense that in Norway, springtime is a big deal after winter. It's a speculation.
Just like in Chicago, trust me.
I was just seeing, I'm trying not to read anything, but in the chat, GE, who I think asked that question, said something about bipolar disorder. And, David, you're just talking about mania. And as a psychoanalyst, I can't help, I don't want to talk diagnostically about Munch or anybody else, but there is a bipolar quality, also that fluctuation between despair and ecstasy. And that the ecstatic is so, the colors are amazing. And oops, you're muted, David.
Of Munch, what a subject for some actor this would be. I mean, I don't know, the more I think about the psychology, I mean, it's fascinating. You're right, this is a great subject.
At the same time, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about, that is Munch really only expressing a personal angst or a personal set of emotions. I came away from the show feeling that he was finding the emotions out in the world. He was finding ample evidence or vibrations of emotions that he was receiving. They weren't only originating with his personal psychology and its problems. And I think that's what, again, reinforces his modernity to me, that he was embedded in a matrix, and the entire matrix was emotional and filled with pathos and insight and grandiosity with the sun and reflection with the moon, but it was sort of all out there somehow, which kind of runs counter to the cliched view that he was the tortured individual, and that's how we understand Munch. Jay was saying about the scream image, or maybe Sarah, that the landscape is screaming as well. And, the cut tree limbs, the cut trees. I mean, I find this great and encouraging, that and very early, an insight that was gained very, very early on, that the world itself is carrying the emotion, and the artist is like sensitive who's receiving it.
Nice.
That makes me so happy. That's one of the aims of the exhibition.
What a great question, GE. That was so generative and exciting. Thank you so much. And thanks again, to you all for answering it. That was our final audience question today. This has been such a great conversation. I'm so grateful to you, Sarah, Jay, David, and Peter. It's been such a wonderful afternoon. We do have a tradition here at the Rail of concluding our community events with a poetry reading. And today I'm thrilled to welcome our poet Alan Fisher to the stage. Poet, painter, and art historian Alan Fisher has been included in over 160 publications. His most recent artist's book is Black Pond. He is Emeritus Professor of Poetry and Art at Manchester Metropolitan University and editor of the journal Spanner and Spanner Editions, and co-publisher of Aloe's books, New London Pride and Edible Magazine. I'm so thrilled for your reading, Alan.
Thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. Good afternoon, everybody. A bit later in the day for me. I'm going to read from Black Pond. It's a very long work. I'm going to read from the 8th section of Black Pond, which has in view Morton Feldman's design for his music projects from the 50s. I'm just going to read through and correct myself en route, I think would be the best thing. Just before it is dark, a hot gas of gauge bosons, scalars, and fermions. DNA told to produce viruses fed by flash drive, to make plastic rather than bacteria, drag their nets by night, crash trades, anamorphosis of reality. Acceleration of human thought, toned and exfoliated, I use every evening, the best product I've ever used, a basket in the darkness of the street, depletion of cortical acetylcholine, grey ecology, pollution at a distance between melancholy and morning, at the end of geography. A rip-off strongs the eclectic, a strip stop towards the majestic, a pit cough rewards this electric, struck by the wildness and empty blue sky, burning wood enlivens its dark. You gaze long into an abyss, gazes into you, gloom of formless matter, extreme redshifts, vivid, vital, vacuum. You raise along through a missile phases you, replace black sail with a white one. The effects of hidden dimensions in brain scenarios, that is to say, brain meaning many dimensions. Room of forlorn sense scatter, a feeling of immediacy, as a darker, bitterer tone develops, viral indistinction, strew of newborn clatter. The logos of the house, our last glacier, the bogus offered now our luck luster, the rotation of swelling our Eton property, a flotation-powered smelting of street and poverty. Ingoing blackness resonates in a scatter, ingrown fracture percolates in chatter, flown fragrance perceived in matter. Ingone blankness requires inner shatter, light through a glass section at the office door. Ingoing rankness blurs in a tatter with coloured blankets and cloths stretched. Ongoing frank mess slews into textile, wit bothered plan chests and bathes the fetched. Onto growbank mist lures into sex mile, into grounding fixed smears into flux style. Over a dome constructed of sticks, flicker of orange light through glass. Intermittent rounding pixelated shears, intermittent fax file. Rover adorn erupted off tricks, ricochet a range bright too fast. Splitter of a range flight through grass. Bitten sounding elated, more bitten foxtail, rebound and straight fright of the vast. Proffered in angled retrospection, attribute top fondle the path septic, a rip-off strongs the electric, a strip stop towards the majestic. The logic of our ecology, our continued disgrace, a recurrent and strained bite of the blast, a pit cough rewards this electric, gloom of formless matter, a skip of wrongs or expected. A striped top rewinds our prophetic, room of forlorn scent scatter, strewn of newborn clatters. To think we could burn and survive, together in open, to gather an apron, shift rough prize of the effect, rift tougher prize the asset, doom of torn spent tatter, boom of worn event matters. On the brink, wood burnt and hived, assembled licton, reassembling lightning, the tragic of our keeping, our mingled misplace, repeated and trained to sight our past, dwelling born of dense embitter, into the darkest corner of the revulsion, stew of new sawn butters, in the sink we could learn and hive, recover in ocean, discover an ocean, the trajectory of thrown our symboled past, restated and brained foresight and farce, into the sharpest burden of the propulsion, a flotation-powered smelting of street and poverty. The prink we should discern and derive, toggle innovation, boggle imitation, ingoing blackness resonates in a scatter, elated and strained before fight and pass, been through raspist weight of the expulsion, a plate motion, showered melting, replete without novelty. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Alan. That was really beautiful and felt like a great extension of this amazing conversation. And again, just such a huge thanks to Jay, Peter, David, and Sarah, and congratulations, Jay, on the amazing, amazing exhibition. And we would also like to give a shout out to Carolyn from the Clarke for supporting us in preparing for today's event. And thank you to the Terra Foundation for American Art for sponsoring our NSE program and for making these daily conversations possible. They also support our growing archive, which you can view on the Rails YouTube channel, and today's conversation will be posted there very soon. For the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has been a platform for the arts, culture, and politics through our monthly publication and public events like our daily NSE. Check the chat for a link to donate to support our work here at the Rail. And please join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Time if you're free for a conversation with Lotus L. Kang and C.A. Conrad on the event of MALT, New York, Lethbridge, Los Angeles, Toronto, Chicago at NCA Chicago. We will conclude with a reading by Coralia Ahmed. Thanks to you all for tuning in today, and you can now turn on your microphones and say hello and goodbye as you leave. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. It was fun.
Thank
It's
you.
really
That was so
good learning
amazing.
experience.
Great poem. That was a
Okay.
great
Thank you
panel.
all.
Thank you.
Show. Alan.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Chloe and Alan.
That was amazing. Thank you. And
Thank
go
you,
to the show if you find yourself at the Clarke.
I hope so.
Thank you,
Thank
Alex.
you all.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Thank you, panel.